Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I want to dive into the crime surge that is happening in Washington, D.C. right now. Also, I apologize. We got our dog's a new squeaky toy, and he's out in the living room playing with it. So if you hear that in the background, that's what that is. But I want to talk about what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, because I think the conversation on the left is being framed as Trump is federalizing the District of Columbia. He has deployed National Guard, and this is part of a larger fascist authoritarian move to consolidate power and take over control. And I think that is absolutely not true. And I want to share my experience living in the District of Columbia, things I saw, things I witnessed, friends who've lived there, things that they experienced, and give you some greater context of what's happening because a lot of times you see stuff in the news and it can be really difficult to understand why certain initiatives are in place and why certain responses are happening in certain areas if you're not from those areas. For example, I'm not from Los Angeles. I've been to Santa Monica once, right? Like I have no context to understand what's happening in Los Angeles. So when it came time for all of the immigration protests, a month or two ago, I had to rely on the news to understand that. So my hope here is that I can provide some context and fact checking based on my experience living in the district and again, observations I had while I lived there. So you may have seen videos like this, but this is going around from Border Patrol and ICE and also National Guard activity in neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. So this is, I think, from a day or two ago.
Good evening. Not just DC Police, we also have Border Patrol, U.S. Customs as well, pulling off over here, HSI. There's a lot happening right here on the scene that we're trying to gather. We were responding to some kind of large federal law enforcement presence. As you can see, a number of federal hopping in their car. Please excuse the language from people in this community. There seems to be some kind of frustration. They're not understanding why this level of response to this community. Let's just keep our eye on this shot right here. There's a number of cars. We're turning around to a scene that also took place here. Again, this is all developing. We're trying to piece together what exactly took place here, but it looks like maybe there were two different things taking place, MPD responding and federal agents responding. We're still trying to gather, but what I can say is the neighborhood here, they're just very upset at this type of response. We had people asking, somebody was hit, I guess, by a motorcycle, and they're like, why do we need this kind of response in our neighborhood to someone who was hit and just needs an ambulance? A lot of questions that they're asking. We're going to have those answers, but it's definitely been a day, Kenneth. We were at Navy Yard earlier where we saw federal law enforcement agents walking the streets kind of for this 30-day operation that we're aware of. The National Guard deployed today. We got that confirmation from the White House. Good evening. Not just...
Okay, so I want to pull up a map here. So Columbia Heights is right here. Just to give you context, so the White House is down here. I used to live in this neighborhood here, so Logan Circle neighborhood. That's about a mile from the White House. So Columbia Heights, maybe like 2 or 3 miles from the White House. So up here on 14th Street. So the further you go up 14th Street, so when you go up to Columbia Heights, Patworth, it's really sketchy. Nothing about Columbia Heights is safe. When I lived there, I can tell you, I did not feel comfortable walking around Columbia Heights at night. There was a lot of loitering around the metro station, a lot of crime, a lot of violence, and it wasn't that far from where I lived. So if you use 14th Street as a good indicator, 14th Street is up here, right? So you could be down here, QRS, where there's a lot of restaurants, and then you go a few blocks up 14th Street, so north of U Street, and you go up here to like Euclid, Fairmont, Harvard Street, Columbia Road. Not very safe. You go over here a bit west, it gets a little bit safer, west of Meridian Hill Park, but further east you go, it's less safe. So in DC, and this is probably the case in a lot of cities too, depending on what side of the street you're on, it can be safe or not safe. So Columbia Heights has not been safe, so I was not surprised at all to see that there was a police response there. But what's interesting about that response is that at least when I lived in DC, I'm sure this is probably the case, there's a lot more affordable housing in Columbia Heights. So because of the cost of rent and how expensive things are, Columbia Heights was one of the neighborhoods where a lot of young people lived. So I have some friends who live there, just because it was closer to downtown, on the cusp of being safe, but not quite safe. And it was just a little bit cheaper. You could get, groups of people would get homes and rent out rooms and stuff there. So the response is also, so the people protesting, I suspect, are probably Gen Zers and young people who have rented in that neighborhood. I don't think they're homeowners. And so they're people who have been incensed by the current zeitgeist of what's happening. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. So I wanted to walk through this Slate article. This came up in my feed. And this was written interviewing a expert about the rise in crime in DC. And so it's called Trump's Real Endgame with Crime in DC is Coming into View. And obviously they're trying to frame this in a particular way. I think Slate is an important publication to look at because that is something that a lot of folks on the left will typically read. So it dives in talking about how President Trump has claimed Washington, D.C. is a hellscape. It's ridden with crime driven by bloodthirsty criminals and roving mobs of wild youth. So the White House is intervening. They argue violent crime in D.C. has been declining and is on track to hit a 30-year low. Okay, let's break this down because this is absolutely not the case at all. I have a bunch of tabs open, by the way, so I'm going to have to parse through some of these. Okay, so the first claim in this article is that it talks about bloodthirsty criminals and roving mobs of wild youth. So there's a lot of crime activity in big cities, DC in particular, especially along the 95 corridor. Anytime you have a major interstate where people can move, easily between cities, you're going to have crime. DC is no exception. And there, at least again, when I lived there from 2014 to 2020. But when I lived there, hi bud. When I lived there, there was a lot of gang activity. MS-13 was really big at the time. So I wouldn't be surprised as well as if there's a lot of gang activity now. So they talk about roving mobs of wild youth. Well, this is absolutely happening. So here is one example. This is a news story that was reported a year ago.
J7 News on your side now is hearing from concerned residents in D.C. after another crime spree led to charges against 3 teenagers.
Our Felicia Ashley joins us live from Vermont Avenue right now. Felicia, some in the community think juvenile suspects are just not facing tough enough punishments to keep them from committing the same crimes.
That's right. And when I'm speaking to community members, they are all saying the same thing. What is going on with these kids these days? And that makes 2 sprees in 2 weeks by 2 separate groups. Take a look at these maps. They show 2 separate crime sprees.
Okay, again, you have to understand the kind of landscape and geography of DC to understand why this is important. Okay, so northeast and southeast are pretty much like the unsafe areas. Like the further you are northeast, if you're north of H Street and eastward, but also southeast and across the river in Anacostia, those are typically unsafe areas. When you're in northwest, those are considered the more, I would say, safer areas. These are places where people desire to live. And for better or for worse, like that's just kind of how the district is set up. And one of the reasons why this is important to pay attention to is because in cities like DC and small cities like this, you kind of have to, I don't want to say protect isn't the right word, but you have to be mindful of the population that is paying the city's bills. And unfortunately, Northeast and Southeast DC are not paying the bills. So let me give you examples here. So this is part of 14th Street that I referenced earlier. I specifically pulled up this part because if you recall recently, there was the 19-year-old Doge staffer that was carjacked. It was right around this area. So these homes here, starting at, row houses starting at 1.5, you can get some for less than $1 million, but mostly you're looking at several $1 million of property. So this part of DC, westward, Kalorama, into Georgetown, obviously very expensive places to live. So as property prices, go up, you as a city can charge higher amounts of you get more taxes out of that, right? So it's property owners and these neighborhoods are subsidizing the budget in the District of Columbia. Now compare that to east of the river. So east in Anacostia and southeast DC, this is Ward 8. Look at the homes. Okay. Look at what we have here. Okay. Again, compare that to these houses. Okay. You have folks who are moving and over east of the river and gentrifying it, so it is increasing property values. But realistically, the majority of crimes being committed in DC are perpetrated by people, unfortunately, living here. And these people aren't paying the bills for the police department to keep people safe. And so when you think about the economics of the city, and I know there's a racial dynamic within DC, and we can have a conversation about that at a separate point in time, but just objectively and economically, okay, you need the people over here on this side of the river to subsidize the police force and the public services and all the goods that everyone on both sides of the river benefit from. And so if these people on this side of the river don't feel safe, they're gonna start leaving. And so what is important about newscasts like this is that over time you've been seeing increased amounts of violence in parts of Northwest where you wouldn't expect violence and where people are paying a premium to live there. And so as the value proposition changes, it's going to change how people live in the district, what kinds of services you have, and what the quality of life looks like. I can tell you, my last visit to the district was in, I believe, 2022, and the old neighborhood I lived in was kind of a shell of its former self. Like, yes, there had been new construction, new development, but there's a lot of closed restaurants. You could just tell. I had friends who were telling me about crime that had increased, and one friend in particular was a property owner and just was living in a part of town where again, like, you wouldn't expect crime, and people pay a premium to live in those parts of town. And so it's kind of like, well, they eventually left in part because I think of the rise in crime, and just it wasn't safe. Why would you ever want to live somewhere where you don't feel safe? And so, I'll give you a couple other examples. This is a news story that was filed in 2024. And it was a carjacking, attempted carjacking of U.S. Marshals who were on detail to protect Justice Sotomayor. It doesn't say where in D.C. this was, just in Northwest, but that it was an 18-year-old who attempted to carjack one of the marshals that was on her detail. And then this is another example. Secret Service agent protecting Biden's granddaughter were open fired, breaking into an SUV. And this happened in Georgetown, which, if you don't know DC, Georgetown is like the opposite of Anacostia. Like, people deliberately live in Georgetown for status. Very expensive to live there. And it's presumably supposed to be very safe. So when you have carjackings in these parts of town on 14th Street, in Logan Circle, in Adams Morgan, in Kalorama, in Georgetown, not only are people not going to want to live there anymore, but restaurants and businesses are going to find it increasingly difficult to operate. I'll, again, just give you an anecdote. I worked at a coffee shop that had opened up in Shaw back in 2016. This was a very controversial development project. Shaw is kind of near Howard University. And they gentrified it all right. They brought in a whole, like it was 4 and 1, the retail level, and then the 4 levels of residential above it. But these apartment buildings that were really expensive. I mean, I toured one with a friend. Again, this was 2016, and a fake 1-bedroom. It had just like 2 walls that had sliding doors, so it wasn't even a real 1-bedroom. But I think that was like $2,000 or $2,100 a month. So I can't even imagine what it is now. But I worked in a coffee shop at the retail level in one of those. There were break-ins all the time. Kit and Ace had opened up a store there. I think that's a sister company to Lululemon, but really overpriced, like t-shirts and stuff, like I think they were selling like $150 t-shirts. And just to give you an idea of like the type of businesses that were there, I think there's an Aesop there now, or a Lalabo, one of those, but a really high-end like lotion and soap company. But you had all these like high-end retailers that had been opening up in Shaw, and they closed. They couldn't keep tenants in the retail spaces because they kept getting broken into. And so it's really hard to build up an economy, and the economy that serves everyone in the community, not just the immediate residents of that neighborhood, if there's no guarantee of safety. So I think that is something to keep in mind. And so, the original report, talks about the youth, says that, roving mobs of wild youth, well, they are a problem. There's no question about that. I think people have observed that with their own eyes. And I will dive into why I think that is in just a moment. But again, he talks about the Doge staffer, who is known as Big Balls. And like I said, he was carjacked in the 1400 block of DC. So on 1400 Swan Street. So right here. So people with, $1.5 million homes. So, that's something to keep in mind. So this article interviews a guy from the Center for the Study and Practice of Violent Reduction at the University of Maryland. The University of Maryland is not in DC proper. I'm going to take a wild guess that this guy doesn't even live in the district. He might live on the periphery, but he probably lives in or around College Park, Maryland, close to where he works. And so I want to call this to attention because oftentimes articles like this and folks on the left will use appeal to authority and appeal to statistics and data to validate their points without acknowledging that the experts they rely on might not really be experts, and the data that they are calling attention to might not actually be valid. And so the first question talks about murder, and I think this is important because it contextualizes how the rest of this conversation goes. So talks about how DC has a high murder rate. And so this Mr. Apt here, he says, it doesn't put DC in the top 10 most dangerous cities in the United States, but it's significantly above average. So it doesn't matter if you're the top 10 or not. If you're above average, you're above average. And if there's a risk of murder, like, you don't want to live there. And, when I lived there was a lot of, well, okay, it's hard to say a lot, right? Because I mean, to his credit, like, how do you compare one to another? But when I lived there, it seemed like there was a sufficient amount of random violent crime to make you reconsider living there. So I'll give you one example. There was a woman, I think this was 2018. There was a woman who was out jogging in Logan Circle, and some random guy just approached her, stabbed her in the neck. She ran to a nearby Chinese restaurant. There's video surveillance footage literally of her dying on the floor. She was bled out and was killed, just out on a run. And at the time, I was working at like a bodega style grocery store part-time near the convention center, and I was walking home, and I lived in that neighborhood. So I was probably 4 or 5 blocks south of this guy when that happened. And that really hits home because, when you're removed from crime, if you're sitting somewhere, rural America, or in otherwise like safe place on Main Street where crime doesn't really happen, it's really hard to envision what this looks like and how it impacts people. But when you're in the proximity of it and it could have been you, and there were multiple times this happened to me in DC, by the way, this wasn't the only time. There were multiple cases of random acts of violence that led to death. And I was fortunately like not in the train car on the metro when something happened, not on this, part of the neighborhood when this happened, not walking in this direction, But stuff like this happens all the time. And it's really hard to live somewhere. Yes, I know that's the risk of living in a big city. But again, when you live in a neighborhood that you perceive to be safe, that people have invested in the real estate of that neighborhood because they believe it to be safe, when you're there and then suddenly it's no longer safe, like, it really gnaws at you. It's like, what am I doing here? Why am I living here? And of course, that leads to increase in crime as people withdraw from the city. People leave. I left. For example, and of course there's replenishment in DC. So DC's kind of a novel city, but people leave. People see the crime. They don't want to be a part of it. They see where their tax dollars are going and how they're not being spent on public safety. And then, of course, post Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, you've seen a push on the left to weaken the police and weaken their ability to enforce laws. And within the local criminal justice system as well, you're seeing recidivism rates, people getting a slap on the wrist and being sent back out into the public. And so, I think that is a important question to consider. It's not, it might not be like the most dangerous city, but it's still dangerous, and that's still relevant. And so he says the timing of the president's announcement is questionable, considering there have been dramatic drops in homicides, assaults with deadly weapons, robberies, and other violent crimes significantly over the past 18 months. In fact, crime is falling faster in DC than it is in other places. So 2 points here. One is that is absolutely not true. There has been allegations that the crime data in DC has been cooked. But another thing I want to call your attention to, because he is comparing different cities here throughout this interview, there was a revision to the FBI crime data. Let me see if I have it. Yep. So what was it? 2021, 2022. So there was crime data that was put out, and it actually ended up being revised. So the initial report that was put out by the FBI showed a 2.1 decrease in violent crime from 2021 to 2022, and that had been corrected to reflect a 4.5 increase. So this happened with the FBI. I think New York City also had some weird data with their crime statistics. So nationwide, we're having a data crisis right now where folks are cherry picking data to fit the specific narratives of what they believe to be true. And that is affecting how we perceive the world around us. And if you live in a big city and you haven't left any time in the last 5 years, you've only had the echo chamber you live in, and you think Trump is an authoritarian, you're looking at you're not understanding the data manipulation that's happening, and you're kind of starting to doubt what's happening with your own eyes. So DC, okay, so the crime data in DC might not actually be true. So a commander was suspended after he was accused of changing crime statistics. This was published in July of 2025. So MPD confirmed Michael Pulliam was placed on paid administrative leave in mid-May. This was after he filed a complaint against an assistant chief and police union because they accused him of deliberately falsifying crime data. And so he was in charge of the 3rd District, which patrols Adam Morgan and Columbia Heights. So that Columbia Heights neighborhood is what I talked about in the beginning, which has been historically unsafe. And so union officials said there's a larger trend of manipulating crime statistics. And so DC Police Union head tells why he doubts city crime statistics. This is more recently from just a couple days ago. But, he talks about it. He says that that he doubts the drop in crime is as large as DC officials are touting. He says it's preposterous to suggest the cumulatively, we've seen 60+% drops in violent crime from where we were in 23 because we're out on the streets. We know the calls we're responding to. So this is kind of what I was getting at before. Like, you have folks who sit in ivory towers and academia and think tanks, and they're considered experts, but they don't have real boots on the ground experience. They're not there. They're not responding to calls. They're just interpreting data that they're being given. And if this is true that this particular police chief did manipulate the data, if it's true that the FBI did indeed manipulate their data, then the conclusions they're coming to aren't actually based on reality. So you have folks like this who are saying, we know the calls we're responding to. They see it with their own eyes. They're observing it. Like, of course, crime is up. And I think anyone can see that, right? I've referenced this in previous videos, but retail theft has been up over the past few years, and we've seen a new normal when it comes to brick and mortar shopping. Cash Jordan covers this in New York City. He's a really great creator, and he has a really great channel, and he's been talking all about how changes have been happening in New York City, the immigration and migrant crisis, and now he's talking more about like ICE enforcement. But one thing that he has covered over the past year or two is just how shopping patterns have changed in cities across the country, specifically New York, but also referencing other cities, places like San Francisco and New York, and how, a decade ago, you could go to any bodega or a CVS or a Duane Reade or wherever in New York City, and you could go buy, deodorant. You could buy shampoo. You could pick something, pint of Ben & Jerry's out of the freezer. No issue. These days, everything is under lock and key. You have to ask someone to pull something out for you. And I remember, growing up, you go to Walmart and sure, the high ticket items were always behind lock and key, right? Expensive headphones, new PlayStation, certain video games, especially in the electronics department. The electronics department, everything was always under lock and key. More recently, though, you see cosmetics that are under lock and key. And it's very strange. It's like, why are, a pack of razors, for example, under lock and key? I had to go to a Walmart when I was in Asheville, and like their entire beauty section had it was its own separate secure area because there's so much theft, and they were trying to deter it. And so you can see the change over time. You can see how, hey, wait a minute. Okay, a few years ago, I didn't have to go through all these hoops and hurdles, and now all of a sudden I do just to buy things, and it's impacting businesses. Some businesses have closed locations in high crime areas because they just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to, enforce it. They can't. It costs a lot of extra money. So why operate in these places? And, Cash Jordan has talked about this with regard to the subway in New York. There are a lot of retail shops in the subway stations. And now a lot of those stations are ghost towns because people just don't want to operate businesses in high crime areas. So you can see the facts on the ground. Even if you might think, okay, well, maybe violent crime is down, you can still see that petty crime is up because there's been changing behavior in how retailers and businesses operate in certain areas and how you're expected to behave as a consumer. So if you have trouble shopping in certain areas, if you don't feel safe walking in a place where you felt safe maybe a year or two ago, that's a good indicator that crime is up. So I think we need to get back to trusting our gut instincts on things. Data can help fill in some of the gaps, but your gut instincts are just as important. Okay, I'm going to clear some of this out. Let me dive back in. Okay, so now, so this started with talking about murder, and now it goes just into crime rate more broadly. So I think that's important as well, and just how the flow of this reporting goes, because it starts with the most violent, heinous thing, and then it kind of flows and mixes in with something less violent. And I think this obfuscates what's going on because you're conflating different things. Just because it might not be the most murder, there might not be the most murders in DC, doesn't mean murders aren't happening, doesn't mean random acts of violence aren't happening, and doesn't mean that's necessarily safer. And so by trying to compare it to other places, especially murder capitals, places like Memphis, places like, New Orleans, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges here. And I think that's a disservice to people who are trying to really get an understanding of how safe or unsafe DC is. Okay, and so again, dives into Trump emphasized juvenile crime in DC, characterizing it as roving mobs of wild youth was actually a state of juvenile crime in DC. So he says in 2024, less than 8% of all arrests in DC were for juveniles, but more than half of carjacking arrests involved juveniles. It's really important to understand that youth crime is important, but is not driving the numbers in DC or in any other city. Okay, so like I said, and the previous reporting I showed with crime rates up. So they are juveniles are committing crimes that is definitely happening. Here's an example. This is from 2025. These are two young boys, 16-year-olds, were arrested Tuesday. This was in June, with all these different carjackings. This is happening. So we can have a conversation about the volume of it, but if this weren't significant, the news wouldn't be reporting it. And I have friends who have talked about the carjackings in DC. And when I lived there, I was concerned about getting robbed. That was the big story. So, you had to, this is something I had to really pay attention to. I even had window covers that I would cover my window so you couldn't see my car. But you couldn't leave stuff out. You couldn't, there was tons of, Prince of Petworth, Popville, is a really good blog that just talks about neighborhood stuff in DC from a local perspective. But there's always stories in Popville about I ran into my apartment really quick and came back and my backpack and everything was stolen out of my car. So you really couldn't leave your car for even a moment without the risk of it being broken into. And so I always, you just don't have anything open. You don't have anything in your car, nothing that someone could potentially steal. So that was the concern when I lived there. I was never concerned about getting carjacked. That was never in the top of my mind. But now, like, obviously carjackings are up. People are talking about it. And you have, kids, 16-year-olds. This is just one news story. But you have 16-year-olds who are running around carjacking people. And so I think one thing to talk about is this is happening in other cities. So this is a story out of Baltimore. This guy was getting a pizza and he was attacked. These kids, he doesn't know, right? Because part of the problem too is if it's late at night and you can't really tell the features of someone, you don't know if someone's 16 years old or 20 years old. And there's that, older teenager range of, you're maybe 16, 17, 18 years old, 19 maybe. And you don't really know if they're actually teenagers or not. So it's possible these guys who jumped this, these three guys right here in this video, it's possible they're older, but it's also possible they're teenagers. But one of the things that they talk about in this story is that, and this is from, when was this? This is from 2024, November 2024. And so they talk about juvenile crime in Baltimore. Baltimore is not that far from DC. I think it's like 40 miles away. And so they say that one of the issues in Baltimore is that juveniles are released back to their parents or guardians instead of being held. So again, you have this this hesitancy to be tough on crime, especially towards juveniles. And the guy who was attacked said, I didn't think I was aware it was as bad as it is. I assumed that if you did something like this to somebody, there was consequences, some capacity, even if you were a juvenile. The fact that you can do something like this and not get caught, or even get caught and get released, which is even worse, that's a major problem. And so Baltimore City has seen a surge in juvenile crime this year. So DC isn't a bubble. Like I said, if you're on that 95 corridor, there's a good chance that whatever is happening in DC is also happening in Philly, is what's happening in New York. Like, these cities aren't just little bubbles all in and of themselves. Sure, they're going to have certain nuances to them. But if juvenile crime is up in one city on the East Coast, it's probably up in other cities. And considering the close proximity of Baltimore to DC, there's a good chance that whatever is happening in Baltimore is probably also happening in Washington, D.C. And so they said they've seen a surge in violent crime. And according to the Baltimore City State's attorney, crime arrests are up 146% compared to 2023. And he argues that the reason for this is truancy. So he's arguing truancy is correlated to the spike in youth crime. Well, DC has a truancy problem. So this is reporting done by the Washington Post. This is from June 2025. And it talks about how according to their data, 1/3 of DC public schools K-12 enrollment were truant this year. And so for more than a decade, district leaders have linked school attendance to youth crime, saying tackling one will curb the other. So there's appears to be a clear correlation between presence in school and a decrease in crime. But this reporting from 2025 is saying that 1/3 of students are not in school. And so this also says, in the district and across the nation, high schoolers have the highest rates of absenteeism. The Post analysis found that DC's truancy problem has been growing the fastest among middle school students, an age group that helped drive the city's spike in carjacking and other serious crime in 2023. Last year, 30% of middle schoolers, or 5 times more students than a decade ago, were truant. So you're seeing people reporting violent crime. There are increased carjackings, right? You can say, okay, maybe 2024, 2025, there may have been a decrease, but again, MPD, at least one MPD head has been purported to have cooked the books. So it's unclear if we can trust the 2024 crime data. It's clear that truancy is still a problem. You are seeing violent crime in Baltimore, and it mirrors some of the same causes as in DC, not that far from one another. So I think it's reasonable to conclude that if you have a high number of kids who aren't in school, they have nothing to do, they're bored. You see all these trends on TikTok too, by the way, of kids doing dumb stuff and they're committing crimes and then posting it. You're seeing roving bands of teenagers in other cities committing crimes. So if that's happening, there's a good chance it's probably happening in DC too. And I think somewhere in here it talked about it, but I forget where. But the existing city government hasn't really done anything. They've talked about how crime or how truancy is a problem, how youth crime is a problem, but they're not really doing anything about it. So he says it's really important to understand that youth crime is important, but it is often not driving the numbers in DC or any other city. It is, right? If you're not in school, if you're not being held accountable, if there's no penalties for what you're doing, if you're just getting a slap on the wrist, okay, today it's a carjacking, tomorrow it's, armed robbery, the next day it's murder, right? These things are all correlated with one another. So just because, maybe the homicide numbers aren't as high as last year doesn't mean crime has just magically gone down by 60%. Like the one guy had noted, like police officers are responding to crimes. They see it with their own eyes. Clearly, this is not the case. So this is talking about charging Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., charging teenagers with criminal charges and prosecuting them as adults, so trying to hold them more accountable. And so this guy says, I think there are jurisdictions that are too permissive in terms of juvenile crime, but you can also go too far and be overly punitive. And so he says what this means is that there's much more important than the message on the street is that you're going to get caught and you're going to get punished, not so much. Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it this or is it that? That's why, for instance, we have very good evidence showing that the death penalty has no deterrence effect. So he's arguing that even if you are hard on crime, it's not going to deter anyone. But again, this is not true, right? So I put a note here, but think about the Tesla takedown protest just from a few months ago, right? You had all these people committing acts of domestic terrorism, violently attacking private property, Tesla dealerships, attacking privately owned Teslas. People would just key Teslas in parking lots. And so you saw this in the news, right? Well, have you heard about a Tesla attack in the last month or two? No. Why? Because Pam Bondi went after the folks who did that. So they filed charges. It was a minimum 5 years up to 20 years in prison. So if you were convicted of throwing a Molotov cocktail, for example, at a Tesla charging station or a Tesla dealership, you're going to do time for it. So suddenly, when there is the threat of going to jail on the line, people have started to, be more respectful of other people's property. So there is a deterrent effect. You can punish people and they will stop doing things if they realize they're going to be held accountable for their actions, but they're not. And like that Baltimore, the guy in Baltimore said, he thought, if you do something wrong, you're going to be, held accountable. And he said, clearly that's not happening. So anecdotally, you have victims of violent crime who are expecting people to be held accountable. They're not being held accountable. And then you have, examples of, the Tesla takedown people who they were held accountable and look, it magically stopped. So he talks about sometimes the implicit message is if you're arrested and 12 hours later, you're back on the street again. They wag their finger at you. And if you have some court date way off in the future, it can feel like you got away with it. Well, this is actually what's happening. So I don't know if you've been following the news lately, but there was a guy who he claims to be a trans woman, but approached a squad of elementary school kids, 10-year-olds in Aurora, Colorado. And prosecutors in Colorado are going to drop kidnapping charges from the guy. So this is what he looks like. He right here, and this is still from the video, he tried to kidnap a child, these kids presumably were outside at recess, approached a kid, tried to kidnap him. This is the guy. He has a rap sheet out the wazoo. This guy should be in a mental asylum. We should bring asylums back, personally. There's no reason why this person should be out in society. And I'm not saying all criminals are like this, but there's a lot of criminals who are like this. And again, DC, a lot of folks who were, there seemed to be a correlation with drug use and crime. So folks who are high on fentanyl, other kinds of stuff, who are committing crimes. Maybe they're not with it mentally. There was a lot of mental illness on the streets within the homeless population in DC, as with any other major city. There's a correlation there. So clearly there's a problem. Maybe you don't put everyone in jail, but we need some sort of solution. We can't just, again, be like, okay, you're not competent to stand trial, even though you just tried to kidnap a child. You can go back into the public. The police know this guy. He's been in multiple times. He has a rap sheet. And the crazy part is if you buy the argument, I think this guy says he's going by Carmen now. If you buy the argument that this is a trans woman, then this, of course, opens up a whole new can of worms for women who are in prisons and might have to share jail cells with this guy. But it is clear, like, you know, you have the Baltimore case, you have this case, 2 anecdotes. I understand that, but it really highlights the fact that you can commit a crime, you will get away with it, and then you can go back and do more. And if kids aren't held accountable for their actions, they're going to keep doing it. And if the Tesla takedown is a good example, when you do hold people accountable, they stop doing things. So again, the way that they have framed this conversation in this piece, they're comparing murder, they're comparing the death penalty to violent crimes, yes, but not at the same caliber. Like, you know, theft and carjackings, not the same as killing someone, but it is a slippery slope where if you keep doing it and you're allowed to keep burglarizing and committing carjackings, like eventually that will lead to killing someone, right? So I think that's important. So the interviewer asked, do you think the National Guard will be able to accomplish anything in terms of crime? A very popular strategy is called the surge. If you're familiar with the war in Iraq, we use the surge there too. It's a temporary flood of enforcement resources into a jurisdiction. Now you may temporarily see a benefit from this flood simply through deterrence, but it's very costly. It's not very sustainable. I'll give them credit there. Surges are not sustainable. You have to actually figure out the root problems and the root causes. So if it is true that truancy from school is one of the problems, maybe start there. Another thing, you know, there is a correlation with who tends to commit these crimes. You don't have kids from private schools in upper Northwest DC committing carjackings. I'll put it that way. So there might be a cultural problem that needs to be addressed as well. So school system, cultural problem. There's all sorts of things you can do early on to nip the bud in crime. You just have to be willing to commit to seeing what is, not what ought to be, and taking, you know, the appropriate actions. And so he says, and using this as a justification for more authoritarian and undemocratic practices. And so this is how this is being framed on the left, that that Trump is implementing the National Guard and ICE and all these folks in order to restore the rule of law. But really, this is him usurping power and acting in an authoritarian way. And so that I don't think is true. So my comparison here is, okay, you have someone who might be using federal forces to enforce the rule of law in a place like DC, or you also have people who are allowed to remain in power and they're not held accountable for their actions. So which is more authoritarian? Trump calling in the National Guard to restore order and the rule of law in a city that is experiencing high levels of crime. We can compare year over year. You know, maybe there has been a decline, but over time, there has definitely been a change in the tenor of DC, and it has gotten more violent to the point where people are leaving the city, businesses are closing up shop, it is becoming a difficult environment for people to operate in. So is that undemocratic? Or is a group of politicians who continue to hold power within DC city government undemocratic? So I'll give you an example. Muriel Bowser was elected in 2014. She's still the sitting mayor. So for over a decade, you have had the same person in office, the same person responsible for safety and maintenance in DC. And if you see a rise in violent crime from her coming into office in 2014 until now, she's clearly not doing her job and she is not being held accountable, right? And so you can argue, okay, well, the voters voted for her. Sure. We also know that there are, you know, mechanisms where that might not be, you know, valid. DC is a highly transient city, right? So the interests kind of shift over time. You have a lot of young people in the city. So they might be voting along ideological lines and they might be ideologically captured. They might not actually be voting and their interests. They might not be, you know, young people don't really participate in local politics. So you have people like Muriel Bowser, you have, you know, DC City Council members who are able to hold on to power and they're not accountable to people, but they keep winning over and over again. So that kind of seems undemocratic as well. Like, yeah, you're using democratic means to stay in office, so it gives the guise that it is democratic. But if you're able to consistently stay in power over a long period of time and you're not being held accountable, like, how is that any less authoritarian than the person in the White House trying to restore law and order? Which, again, for context here, this is the White House, okay? So violent crime is happening within a mile of the White House. And I think What's hard with DC is that it's a high, and they talk about this in the article. It's a hybrid federal and municipal area. So DC is not a state, but it is a municipality. It has its own metro police department, but it also has other competing forces. You have Secret Service, you have Capitol Hill Police. So you have different jurisdictions and people who have different. There's a Navy Yard. There is. And in Anacostia, there's military bases. You have also, the military element. So you have different things. And again, I'll give you an anecdote. I lived on C Street, 13 Southeast. Okay. So I lived over here on this block of C Street. So not too far from not Navy Yard, barracks. So there's this is a barrack, right? The Marine Barracks is right here, so not too far from there. Okay, so I lived on this block of this block, and so this building right here is public housing. So I lived over here, and this is public housing. And so one thing I learned the hard way is I lived in a house with random people I met on Craigslist, and one of the girls who lived in my house was not the most responsible person. She would frequently come home late at night, and not lock the door. And this was a neighborhood where, any part of DC, but this is a neighborhood you need to lock the door. And not even just not lock the door. She would leave the front door wide open, and the screen door would unlock, screen door, anyone could just walk in. And so her and I had a few hearts about that. But what I learned, because I was concerned about that and wanted to understand, what was going on. We lived across the street from a housing complex. So she would leave the door open. Anyone could come in, and the public housing in DC has its own separate police force. So MPD is responsible for my side of the street, whereas the DC Public Housing Authority would be responsible for over here. So even if a violent crime happened, who responds to it varies based on the property where that violent crime happened. So it could be, whether it is in a federal building or not, but even if it's in a DC public building versus a private building. And so this makes it really hard to maintain law and order in a community or in a city, because you have competing jurisdictions. And I've worked with some folks who used to be on Capitol Police Department. I know, from their stories, they told me there's a lot of just competition. People, MPD didn't like Capitol Police. And I think you saw this a little bit on January 6th, by the way. If you kind of look and see how that played out, just certain people were willing to stand down, certain people were not. You don't have continuity in how policing is done in a city like DC. It's very different than other cities like New York or Chicago or LA, where it's, municipally run. You have the federal government in DC. And so you have federal government buildings, areas where there's federal government. Like I said, there was a police barracks on Barracks Row. So you have, or not police, the Marine Barracks. So the Marines are in charge of that. So you have all these different jurisdictions. And so all of this is federal, right? All of this is federal. So if the government is concerned about crime happening here, they're going to want to take action. And part of that, too, is DC has a history of, because it wasn't safe, especially during crime waves in the 80s and 90s with the crack epidemic. DC had a reputation of not being safe for foreign diplomats. So it was actually a hardship post. So in the same way, if you were a U.S. diplomat and you went to a place like maybe Pakistan or Libya or, any sort of country that's not safe, Sudan, if those would be considered hardship posts, people who sent their ambassadors, their diplomats to DC to live on Massachusetts Avenue on 14th Street, right? Those were hardship posts. So a lot of times they wouldn't even send their spouses or their children because they were dangerous. And so that's something to keep in mind. DC has a history of this, and they want to turn the city around. They want to make it into a place where people want to live. They want to make it into a place where you can do business. They want to make it into a place where the government can function. And if you have roving bands of teenagers committing crimes, they're not in school, no one's holding them accountable, and if they, go into the court of law, well, because they're kids, we don't want to be too tough on them, there's no consequences for their actions. So you're going to keep seeing this happen over and over and over again. And so I think that's why it's important. So he says here, it's unclear how other federal agents can help beyond their traditional roles. Well, there's a clear opportunity for them to help here, right? Like I said, DC is on the I-95, right? There's lots of interstate crime that is happening, but also there's a lot of gang activity that has been happening in cities across the United States. So you have transnational criminal organizations who are operating domestically within the United States. Some of these are retail crime rings. Some are cartels. Some are affiliated with different migrant groups. You have all sorts of different groups of people who are operating across state lines, and they're operating transnationally. So yeah, you do need some type of federal agents to come in to help, because you've already disclosed in this article that it's hard for different police forces within the District of Columbia itself to coordinate with each other and to, figure out who has jurisdiction where and how to operate. So if you can't do that within a 10 square mile city, maybe you need the federal government to come in as a top layer to help with coordination. Like if on the street I lived on, if MPD couldn't coordinate with the DC Housing Authority to coordinate who would respond to incidences, how do you expect anywhere else within the city to be able to coordinate? So I do think that matters. So he talks about how you help crime come down. So there's 3 principles: focus, balance, and fairness. So he says you need to identify those people who are disproportionately causing the crime and violence, and you have targeted strategies for them. And those strategies are generally more successful than untargeted strategies because of all the collateral negative consequences of overbroad strategies that can end up stigmatizing entire groups of people and entire communities with a broad brush of violence and violent responses. I have no idea what he said in that sentence. I have no idea what he's trying to get across. I use strategies 1, 2, 3 times in a sentence. Okay, maybe we do need to stigmatize people. Maybe we do need to call out what is happening. If there is a correlation, doesn't mean causation, but if there's correlation where certain groups of people are causing crime disproportionately higher rates than others, maybe it's worth calling it out. If the majority of people who are causing crime or are perpetrators of crime in DC live east of the river in Ward 8, which is historically impoverished, underrepresented, maybe call attention to that. And I'm not saying you paint people with a broad brush stroke and say everyone who looks like the people who live in Ward 8 are criminals, but just understand where the crime is coming from and how it is coming. There's, people talk about folks in Georgetown being racist, right? Georgetown does not have a metro station. And one of the reasons why is they did not want the riffraff from Anacostia coming to Georgetown. So they made sure that when the metro was built, it went straight from Foggy Bottom to Roslyn on the other side of the river in Virginia. They did not want a stop in Georgetown. And you can call it racist, you can call it what it is. But there's no metro in DC because people were very concerned about riffraff coming, and it's clear that hasn't been solved at all. We're having the same conversation we've been having for decades now at this point. Columbia Heights, like I said in the beginning, that was kind of near the epicenter of the crack epidemic. It's still not safe in Columbia Heights. So whatever strategies have been implemented over the past few decades, they're not solving any of the problems. So maybe we do need to have different strategies, and maybe we do need to target groups of people who are perpetrating these crimes and let them know, in a civilized society, this is not how we behave. This is not how we're going to do things. There is accountability. There are laws. You are responsible for them. You need to go to school. You need to, do whatever. We need to hold people accountable. And so long as there's no accountability for crime. And one thing, just kind of going back to, I didn't mention this with the public housing facility that I lived right next to, but public housing complexes, and this might be true in other cities, so if you're familiar with public housing, please definitely add your comments. But in DC, they were well known as places where you could get away with anything because they were outside the jurisdiction of MPD. So there are places within the District of Columbia where crime is somewhat permissible because the police doesn't have the ability to enforce laws. They are secondary to whatever other agency has jurisdiction there. And that could be part of the problem too. Again, correlation does not equal causation, but if you're seeing a large number of people in a certain part of town at a certain socioeconomic status causing certain problems, maybe there's a correlation there. And the folks on the left are like, well, these people are poor and they're underrepresented and that's why they're committing crimes. No, if you're poor and struggling, you're going to steal bread. You're going to steal good food for your family. You're not going to carjack, right? You're not going to go into Lululemon and rob Lululemon, which you're seeing in cities as well. It's clear that's not what's happening. So we need to parse through those narratives as well and just stop talking about stop talking about these people as just innocent, helpless people who are victims of structural racism and structural problems. We need to hold people accountable at all levels of society. Okay. He says, in every strategy, you need to engage these people in places with the highest risk of violence with a combination of empathy and accountability. Well, accountability clearly isn't happening for all the reasons I laid out. And I guess empathy might work, but also maybe just punish people for their crimes and make them not want to commit the crime again. You can be empathetic towards people and understand, people grow up in hard areas. They don't have a good upbringing, whatever. But at the end of the day, people are sovereign and they are free agents of change and they can make better choices. And okay, maybe if you're 12, 13 years old, 14, 15, hard to make a change. But, if you're a teenager, you're a young adult, you're capable of making better choices in your life. So treat teenagers as the young adults and the, ascending young adults that they are. Stop coddling them and hold them accountable. And so he concludes by saying, if you look at this latest effort by the Trump administration, it is massively unfocused. It has no targeting that we know of, and it's certainly not targeted towards specific people or specific places. Yeah, it is. Okay, so if Trump really was an authoritarian and he really wanted to take over all these major cities, why not just declare martial law? He could do that. Why not? Why not just take over? Why is it that these police forces or these activities are happening in places like Columbia Heights? Okay. There's a reason why they're happening in places like that. So it is very focused. It is targeted. Why do you think ICE has been raiding where ICE is raiding? If ICE was really out to get everyone, you would have large street patrols. You actually would have a Gestapo style secret police where they would be asking neighbors to inform on one another. I don't think that's been happening. No one from the government has come to me and said, hey, who are your neighbors? How many of them do you think are illegals? Because that's what happened in Germany. They asked for neighbors to inform on one another. That's what happened in Soviet Russia. You informed on your neighbors. So we're not seeing that. We're not seeing the secret police come out looking to round people up. And we're not seeing martial law being declared across the country. You are seeing targeted efforts. These police forces, federal police forces, ICE, those kinds of things, they have limited resources, right? So they're being very strategic and targeted in how they're apprehending people, how they're going after criminals, who they're going after, right? So it's not just this broad stroke, we're just gonna take over the city. If they really wanted to do that, you would see, the police starting to take over, honestly, I would see it more like a South Africa style situation where you would see the wealthy elites within DC seeking private protection over their area, right? So if you really wanted to take over a city, you would start with getting the elites on board. You would declare martial law, but you would start by getting the elites on board. Go to places like Georgetown and Kalorama and Upper Northwest. You would start having, de facto privatized police forces there, enforcing the rule of law within specific neighborhoods and enclaves. And that's not what's happening. They're going after where the criminals are. They're going after where people are actively engaged in crime. So it seems like decent policing to me. It's just over the past 5 years post George Floyd, we're so not used to policing that it looks abnormal and it looks like disproportionately responsive when in reality it's just policing. Okay. And said it will be largely perceived by the people of DC as unfair because they were not consulted. Okay, folks, we seem to love having consultations. If you are concerned, go to your city council meetings. Go to your town board meetings. Go vote in your elections. I have a friend who she volunteered. She volunteered to run the local elections, I think in June, in her town, and no one showed up. I think they had 7 people vote in this whole town, right? Okay. The polls were open all day. I think she was there for 12 hours. Only 7 people showed up, right? So if you really care you are consulted. You are consulted every single time there's elections, right? If you are so concerned, show up. Start participating. Hold people like Muriel Bowser accountable. Say, no, we do not accept this. Go to your meetings. I mean, again, when I worked at that coffee shop in DC, one night I was working. I don't know why this person chose it, but whoever the city councilman was for that neighborhood came to the coffee shop, and he had a de facto town hall. And one of the things, a lot of people showed up and they were talking to him, and I was listening. And one of the things they were really concerned about was parking. And this was something I had not even considered. But what was happening in residential areas that were being gentrified in DC is that you had developers who were buying single family homes and was converting them into condos. So a 3-story townhouse that was a single family home way back when was now being converted into like 1 and 2 bedroom single level condos. So instead of renting a property to one family, now you had 3. Okay. Parking didn't magically increase. Everyone has the same access to parking. So assuming you have couples in both houses and all of them, and max level say they each have a car, that's 6 cars. So in a home that maybe had 1 or 2 cars, you now have up to 6. So of course there was problems with parking. And so they were really concerned about that, and they showed up and voiced their concerns. So if you don't like what's happening, go to the school board meeting, become involved, right? Like, understand what's happening. Go mentor. One of the reasons why these kids aren't going to school is because in DC and in other cities, the more affluent people leave the city once they start having children, they don't want their kids going to DC public schools. They see how bad they are. They don't want their kids going to Baltimore city schools. They see how bad they are. So they leave. They take their kids to Bethesda. They take their kids to Fairfax County. They take them to Loudoun County. They go to Virginia. They go to Maryland. They live in the suburbs. Same with New York. They go to Westchester. They go upstate. They go into Connecticut because they don't want their kids going to public schools because they're crime ridden. So if you live in one of these cities, if you're a constituent and you want to be consulted, go to where the crime is happening. Go to these middle schools. Be a volunteer. Okay. Even if you're a young intern on Capitol Hill, there's nothing stopping you from participating. If you're a voter and you live in one of these cities, it's your obligation to participate in the politics of those cities. And if you're not doing so, don't appeal to some consultant to come in and tell you how to run your city. Go be an active participant in it and see the change that happens. If more people participated in their city governments, in their communities, if they volunteered and they met the needs where they are, you would see a reduction in crime. Guarantee it. So I'll leave you with that. This kind of stuff gets me all worked up because you just see how the story and the narrative is being manipulated in order to fit a narrative. And it's increasingly, Trump is an authoritarian. The right are crazy far right. They're neo-Nazis. They're coming to take over. And that's absolutely not true. I just poked all these different holes in this story. The data isn't true. The appeal to authority, the guy probably doesn't even live in DC who's talking about this. So he's talking about things as he perceives them to be, not as they actually are. But the people on the ground, the police officers on the ground who are saying, hey, no, I'm seeing things with my own eyes that don't align with this, they're shut down, right? We're not going to listen to the true experts who are the ones on the ground. We're not going to listen to, what's happening in the school system. We're not going to look at those root causes. Most of these people, guarantee you, every single person who lives here has never been over here. They have no idea what happens in Ward 8 because they don't go there. They don't participate. They have no idea. That's just, it's a problem with a lot of cities. I'm guilty of this too. For the 6 years I lived in DC, I never once crossed the river to Anacostia. It's being developed now. So, I think more and more people are going over there, partly out of economic necessity. But that's the reality of it, is it's a very fragmented city. Very racially divided, very socioeconomically divided. And so stuff like this is hard. But when you have stories like this, it paints everything with a broad brush stroke and makes it seem like, okay, so his real end game, Trump's real end game. Trump has no real end game. He just wants the rule of law. That's what everyone who voted for him wants. We want the rule of law back. So yeah, I'd love to know what you think. If you've been paying attention to this and following all the crime stuff, I'd love to know your thoughts and perspective. And if you live in a big city or have lived in a big city, if you can relate to some of this. But yeah, that's what I have for you. If you like this analysis, I would love it if you'd like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.